primer on diversification. Diversification is as old as the Bible. In fact, in the Old Testament, we have numerous examples of diversification. When Jacob thought that his estate may be threatened, he divided all of his possessions into three. When Joseph's brothers went to Egypt to procure food for their family during a hunger, they went through 10 separate ways so that if one of them gets caught or harmed, the family won't starve. And when King Solomon was instructing the next generation, he cautioned them to divide your investments among many places, for you do not know what risks might lie ahead. So if we accept that there is some merit to diversification, the bigger question is, what exactly does that look like? What is its ultimate purpose, and how is it best achieved? The rest of this discussion will focus on answering these broad questions. And let's begin with what is diversification. The primary function of diversification is to reduce risk, not to enhance or increase returns. As Benjamin Graham, the father of value investing, once said, "The essence of investment management is the management of risks, not the management of returns." And the ability of diversification to reduce risk is what Nobel Prize winner Harry Markowitz termed the only free lunch in investing. Diversification can play a number of purposes, but for most high net worth investors and institutions, the primary purpose is achieving greater stability and predictability in an endeavor that is by definition unpredictable. Before we turn to explaining how diversification is best achieved, let me first tackle what we mean by the only free lunch in investing. Simply put, this graph, created by Harry Markowitz 6 decades ago, demonstrates that if you took your total portfolio and divided it in half, one half was invested in treasuries, yielding 6% at a volatility of 5%, which is how Harry Markowitz defines risk, and the other half in the S&P 500, with a return of 12% and a volatility of 18%. For this combined portfolio, your return should be the average of the two, being 9%, and your volatility should be the average of the two, being 12.5%. However, thanks to the effect of diversification, instead of volatility being 12.5%, it's actually closer to 9 or 10%. That reduction in risk without reducing return is the free lunch. The reason that market drawdowns require careful attention is because once drawdowns hit certain levels, the required returns to get back to even become virtually unrealizable. As well, volatility is unnerving and can be especially harmful when it coincides with the need to pull money out of the markets. Therefore, minimizing volatility is one of the clear benefits of diversification. About 2 decades ago, two-time Jeopardy champion Dr. Wayne Winston introduced a radical change in the way that professional basketball teams compete by proving that teams can win tournaments by simply controlling the order of when they play which teams and the mix in which they play certain players. It doesn't require having the best players in the league. Instead, by simply maximizing the potential of the individuals involved, using them in optimal combinations, and properly matching them to the weaknesses of their opponents. This method has helped the Dallas Mavericks rise from being among the worst team in the leagues in the 90s to being one of the most dominant ones in the 2000s. In investing terms, Wayne Winston introduced to basketball the art of asset allocation, the most critical component of diversification. According to David Swensen, the legendary chief investment officer of the Yale Endowment, asset allocation is just one of 3 drivers of returns in investing. The second is security selection, in other words, picking the right company, the right asset, or the right stock. And the third is market timing, by cleverly timing when you will buy or sell an asset. So of the 3, just how important is asset allocation to investing results? Well, if you look at the research, it appears to be pretty darn important. Virtually every study ever conducted suggests that it is the single most important driver, accounting for most of the variability in returns. What this graph makes patently obvious is that most investors are focusing on the wrong thing. Most spend the largest portion of their time deciding which stock or property to buy, when the most important question, ultimately, is how much, if any, of each asset they should have. Having the right investment only accounts for a small fraction of the variability in returns. For proper diversification and greater predictability, what's much more important is the configuration of all the assets involved. And you might ask, well, why is this true? And the answer has to do with the concept of correlations. Correlations. In simple terms, the correlations between two assets describe how much one zigs when the other one zags. If two assets move in the same direction as the top line illustrates, there's no diversifying benefit of these two assets, as they obviously derive their value from the same source. Conversely, if two assets move in opposite directions or without any relationship to one another, then clearly these two derive their value from altogether different sources and provide a diversifying benefit to one another. Simply put, positive correlation is bad, negligible or negative correlation is good. The absence of a positive correlation is an essential element of diversification. The problem is that most investors think they have uncorrelated assets when in fact they do not. Many advisors would have you believe that diversification is some variation of this. The problem with all of these asset classes is that they are all in public markets and subject to a narrow range of similar risks. The purpose of diversification is to be a ballast when markets are tumultuous. And 2008 demonstrated just how inadequately diversified most people were. Advisors may frequently reference this graph, which shows that in any given year, some assets are on the top, some are on the bottom. The reality, however, is that by diversifying across all of these groups in 2008, maybe I would have been down 35% instead of 50% for the S&P 500. That may be better, but not enough to start dancing. And as this graph on correlations shows, this level of diversification is insufficient because it fails you when you need it most. So if the traditional 60-40 model of stocks and bonds does not suffice for diversification, what should we use to drive asset allocation? Superior asset allocation ultimately comes down to three elements: broader asset classes, diverse managers, and isolated risks. Let's spend a couple minutes analyzing each of these. Broader asset classes. Unlike the traditional model of investing in stocks and bonds, more sophisticated investors have a much more diversified toolkit. They include things like real assets, real estate, private equity, credit, and uncorrelated return. Typically, these asset classes have only been available to large institutional investors. And fortunately for all of us, that is no longer the case. It's important to remember that stocks and bonds may be a small representation of the economy, but they are not the economy itself. When equity markets are booming, the average Joe's salary isn't necessarily growing in tow. And when credit markets are crashing, people are still paying their rent, buying food, and using basic utilities. As such, it is important to remember that there are ways to make money even when public markets are in turmoil. Over the last 20 years, all institutional investors have been increasing their exposure to private equity, credit, real estate, infrastructure, and other asset classes that aren't subject to the same irrational whims of public markets. They've referred to these broadly as alternative investments. And the reason is obvious: having broader diversification yields better results. According to research by groups such as Lipper and Guggenheim, here's an example of what happens when you add a bit of non-traditional or alternative asset classes into the mix. You get the double whammy of simultaneously increasing return and reducing the risk. And what could be better than that? As we said at the outset, the primary purpose of diversification is risk reduction, not return enhancement. However, simply by reducing the risk on an ongoing basis, there's actually a very good chance that it would also translate into higher returns. The question, of course, is why? Why would a mix of traditional and non-traditional asset classes achieve greater returns with less risk? And if that is the case, why aren't more investors and more financial institutions offering the extended mix to their clients? To answer that question, we have to return to where the current fixation on stocks and bonds comes from. As we saw on the graph illustrating why diversification is the only free lunch in investing, in 1952, Dr. Harry Markowitz formed the basis of what is today known as modern portfolio theory. At the heart of that theory is the Markowitz frontier, otherwise known as the efficient frontier, which you see on the screen. The efficient frontier suggests that using stocks and bonds, you can achieve portfolio efficiency, beyond which point superior returns are impossible. The problem is, when Markowitz formulated his theory in 1952, all he had at his disposal was data on a handful of stocks from the New York Stock Exchange and T-bills. Consequently, he had no way of accessing data on asset classes such as real estate, private equity, or infrastructure, which is difficult to analyze even today. On top of which, many of today's commonly employed uncorrelated strategies, such as commodity trading advisors or merger arbitrage, didn't even exist in Markowitz's day. As a result, his estimation of what was possible was drastically limited. Yet those in the financial service industry saw the opportunity, grabbed Markowitz's findings, and ran with it as fast as they could. Financial professionals are utilizing Markowitz's frontier to create simplistic illustrations like this one for their clients. The problem, of course, is that illustrations like this one only really utilize two asset classes, stocks and bonds. You may ask yourself, well, why do financial institutions perpetuate this notion? Why are they not eager to progressively move toward less correlated assets and help their clients achieve better results? The answer is because it is incredibly inefficient for them. Firms managing money need to scale investments for thousands of clients. The second that someone with $10 million walks through their doors, to maximize their profitability, most financial service firms need to have the ability to immediately deploy that capital. They need to immediately offer a diversified solution. And so the liquid public markets of stocks and bonds give them the opportunity to do so. On the other hand, best practice diversification, as exercised by the world's most sophisticated investors, involves accessing non-publicly traded investments. These are not nearly as liquid or as scalable. And if large financial institutions actually attempted to employ them, they would be forced to manage far fewer clients and have to do much more work for each of those clients. That would obviously eat into their margins, and by this point, you have completely lost their attention. My only request of each of you is that you not fall victim to this. Instead, find ways to achieve proper diversification and access all of the tools at your disposal. As you can see, by pushing out Markowitz's efficient frontier, not only would you decrease the risk of your investments, but can potentially even increase your returns. Why would the risk be lower? If you wanted to understand why the risk is reduced when you leave public markets, it's important to understand the two types of risk embedded in public markets. Those two being systematic risk and unsystematic risk. Systematic risk is what we saw in 1929, 1987, or 2008. It is the whims of public markets. It is something that no investor can control. The impact of those whims can be mitigated by hedging, but it is almost impossible to manage entirely. Unsystematic risk, or common risk, is the risk of an individual company or industry being impacted. For example, if Ford automakers go on strike, or if Apple comes out with a malfunctioning technology. As you can see on the graph, diversification across industries, companies, and geographies can help you mitigate unsystematic risk. However, systematic risk in public markets still remains. So by investing in assets that don't have exposure to public markets, you can significantly reduce your exposure to systematic risk, For example, if you owned an apartment building in the fall of 2008, what difference did it make to you where the S&P 500 was? You were likely still collecting your rent. Diverse managers. Aside from broader asset classes, superior diversification must also include greater diversity of investment managers and individual positions. As we have seen with the likes of Lehman, Bear Stearns, and Merrill Lynch, no one financial institution, irrespective of size, is too big to fail. Even giants like Citigroup or AIG barely made it off of life support in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. Consequently, having too much exposure with any one manager or one financial institution may pose an unnecessary risk. Whether it's historic blow-ups like long-term capital management or Amaranth Advisors, or simply large groups like SocGen or Barings that paid a high price for terrible mistakes, we have come to learn that no one is so smart that they cannot make bad decisions. Lastly, it should be noted that manager selection is of extreme importance. It is outside the scope of this discussion, but critical for that last 5 to 10% of return, which asset allocation cannot account for. This is especially true for managers in non-traditional asset classes, where their dispersion of returns is far greater. In other words, those who are good are really good, and those who are bad are really bad. Whereas in traditional asset classes, you have a lot more hovering around the middle of mediocrity. Isolated strategies. There are a variety of risks in the market. Geography risk, industry or sector risk, currency risk, credit quality, duration, inflation, volatility, illiquidity. Each of these can be protected against and even taken advantage of. However, what is virtually impossible is a silver bullet solution. There is no single asset class that will protect against all of these risks. Therefore, true diversification requires a rifle versus a shotgun approach. Let's take inflation as an example. Asset classes such as credit will be adversely affected when there is sharp inflation. Bonds will be affected when there are rising interest rates, and public equities can be adversely affected by long stretches of drawdowns or volatility. At the same time, farmland can protect against inflation, leveraged loans with floating rates can protect against rising interest rates, and income-producing real estate can protect against volatility. The important thing is that every risk is considered and insured. It is often remarkable how every homeowner I've ever met will have insurance against floods, fire, theft, and a whole slew of other potential harms. Yet these very same individuals rarely succeed in insuring what may be the largest portion of their estate, their investable assets. Adopting a perspective where we isolate individual risk factors and inoculate ourselves from them is the essence of diversification. Over-diversification. Now that we've touched on diversification, it would be prudent to turn our attention to what would be considered over-diversification, or as some in the industry call it, diversification. While diversification is ensuring that our assets are not at risk by being in too few baskets, over-diversification is the risk of spreading your eggs around to too many baskets. Over-diversification can lead to dulled impact on the portfolio and provide index-like returns. And while you may not experience meaningful losses, you won't experience meaningful gains either. On top of which, over-diversification can create a monitoring challenge. More complexity means there's more room for error, as failures are often neglected and poorer oversight for the portfolio overall. So what are some symptoms of over-diversification? The first symptom would be if you're unsure about the role of the investment in your portfolio. Diversification is a bit like cooking. A dish can include a number of ingredients, but it's important to understand their role and appropriate proportions. If you're making a stew, but put in more garlic and salt than core ingredients like meat, vegetables, and rice, you won't have many requests for seconds. Likewise, if you want your portfolio to provide you with your desired outcome, you must have a good grasp of the recipe, namely the appropriate ingredients and proportions thereof. The second symptom would be if you own multi-manager products. Multi-manager products would be something like a fund of funds, or any basket of many investment managers, which was not deliberately constructed for your personal needs and considerations. And the third symptom of over-diversification is wide diversity of position sizes. For example, if the position sizes of your investments ranged from 0.5% to 25% of your portfolio, it's likely a problem. Other than one's core business, there should be some rationale to every investment position and why they are sized the way that they are. Position sizing. That leads us to the question, what is an ideal size of an individual investment or a single position? I must start by pointing out that research on position sizing is fuzzy at best. Furthermore, one must distinguish between positions which are individual securities, assets, or stocks, and positions which are individual managers, who may be further diversified holding a basket of securities or assets. You can't treat one stock the same way that you would treat a portfolio of stocks. The research on individual stocks or securities is pretty clear, especially in public markets. It seems that 20 to 25 securities, and some studies suggest that as few as 15, should suffice for diversification purposes. When it comes to investment managers, however, the closest thing to empirical data is within the realm of research on efficacy of fund of funds. In those studies, it seems that anything beyond 15 to 20 hedge fund managers achieves little to no benefit of diversification. Whether or not that translates into a private investor's portfolio is somewhat unknown. So for private investors, we have to take a slightly more rudimentary approach to this whole enterprise, which involves a bit of art and science. We have found that generally having 25 to 35 positions, which includes a mix of investment managers and individual assets, provides a high level of diversification in all market conditions. Having approximately 30 positions would translate into an average position of about 3% of a portfolio. Accordingly, depending on the level of conviction and risk, position sizes should generally range between 1% and 5% of one's portfolio. This allows for positions to be small enough that you can, at least theoretically, lose it without impacting your lifestyle or losing any sleep. Conversely, it is still large enough to make a difference and diversify away a specific risk. Diversification challenges. As with all great endeavors, diversification may be simple to understand, but not easy to employ. In fact, it often requires us doing many things that are unnatural to us. And I want to close this discussion by highlighting the several psychological barriers that tend to stand in our way. For one, we can't envision what has not been. Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize-winning psychologist and author, demonstrates that people will only envision risk to be as bad as something that they've seen or experienced in their lifetimes. They cannot grasp the concept of something worse occurring until it actually does, and thereby rarely prepare accordingly. The challenge is compounded by the fact that there is no sense of urgency. By definition, you can only diversify when times are stable. Yet this is when it seems least compelling to do so. In fact, at the height of any bubble, when it seems like everyone is making money hand over fist, is usually, and most unfortunately, the moment that most investors abandon the principles of diversification. Owning some assets you hate. Diversification is an exercise of picking your poison. You can either regret not making enough, or you can regret not losing more than you anticipated. Effective diversification begets more of the former and less of the latter. It works over time, but not every time. Most of the time, diversification is going to seem like a wasted effort. Jason Zweig refers to it as the umbrella you never seem to need. Yet no matter how many times you carry an umbrella without needing it, when a downpour finally hits, you are so bloody grateful it's there. Wealth was not created by diversification. For entrepreneurs, this point is the most salient. No one you know has become fabulously wealthy by diversifying. In fact, wealth creation at its core requires deep and dedicated focus on one business or strategy or industry. However, once someone has created wealth, they are then asked to do something that is counterintuitive to what has made them successful to date. to stop focusing their efforts and start diffusing them across asset classes, strategies, and managers. Diversification involves entering foreign frontiers. Because we are all afraid of the unknown, investors have a tendency to invest a disproportionate amount of their net worth in familiar or local assets, irrespective how risky they may be. Dr. Peter Kenning, a professor at Germany's University of Munster, demonstrated that the mere thought of putting money in foreign securities actually generates an automatic sense of discomfort, triggers activity in the amygdala, and sends fear through the investor's body. The challenge is that diversification invariably forces us to invest in things that may have been foreign to us. Notwithstanding these mental barriers and challenges, it behooves every investor to get educated about diversification, as countless fortunes have been lost due to failure to diversify. Therefore, investors would be best served stepping a little outside of their comfort zone and being more vigilant about diversification, because the price of failure is much, much greater.